first formed. Anyhow, we are internationally syndicated, starting with our home base, UPRN, United Public Radio Network, which happens to be 107.7 FM, New Orleans, Louisiana, and a lot of affiliates, including one of the ones that has carried my show for several years, Deprogrammed Radio in the UK with their terrestrial affiliates in London and Leeds. And like I said, UPRN has a lot of affiliates, places that you might not even think would be listening to these types of shows, or in general, American radio, like Hong Kong, and which brings the show that much further eastwardly into China and so on and so forth. I'll let you all leave it to your imagination, or for those of you literally listening abroad, you already know this. There's nothing new about this. Now, let's talk about today's show. Today's guest is somebody I've been really wanting to talk to for a long time, and when I finally had a chance to connect with him and actually get him on the phone and talk to him before the show, he's way incredible person, and I know this is going to be an amazing show. Just to throw some hints for you, he was, as a matter of fact, the majority speaker. The movie, the documentary Mirage Men, was basically about him and what happened during his life in the Air Force, specifically the OSI, Office of Special Investigations. So I probably said enough that you guys already have an idea of who I said, and so I might as well introduce him. That happens to be the one and only Mr. Richard Doty. Rick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. J. It's good to be on your show, finally.
The pleasure is all here. It's absolutely all here. Now, as I mentioned beforehand, because you were able to describe for me the differences, I want to take you back in time. What year did you join the actual, just the Air Force? Not the OSI, but the Air Force in general?
In 1968.
Wow. Okay. Now, from what we talked about before, so your career, clearly career, because if in 10 years after Air Force, then within the Air Force, you joined the OSI at 78 to 88. That's a 20-year run. If you don't mind me asking, did you come in as an listed or an officer, an E or an O?
No, I came into regular Air Force as an enlisted in 1968.
So by the time, this is part of the answer that you'd given me, so I'm just going to spit it out there. To get into the OSI, the Air Force doesn't come around and say, okay, we see that you're going to be a good investigator or you have intelligence for this. You had to apply, right?
Yes, I actually got out of the Air Force and then applied for OSI, and then went through a selection process. It took about 7 months. Involved a polygraph and detailed background investigation before I was accepted into OSI.
Now, I'm glad you just actually managed that, or mentioned the fact that you left the Air Force and then applied for the OSI. What rank were you, real quick, when you left in 78 before you applied for OSI?
I was a technical sergeant in E6.
E6, okay. That's. I would think that right after that, E7 is officer, or I couldn't tell you because only my brother's military, the station owner's military, and from only what I've seen and talked to other guests. But I would E6. I know. That's 6 pay grades, 5 different promotions, and I would think that's phenomenal in 10 years. That's just from what I know. But at what point does an enlisted man become an officer? I know this is a little off where we're going, but just out of curiosity.
You have to be accepted into a officer training program, and then you go to officer candidate school, and then you're commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Air Force.
Okay, so OCS, that's the same thing I would think that applies, because I remember when the Marines wanted to get me in law school, they were talking about I would have to go to basic training and then OCS. Okay, so that's kind of standard. Now let's return back to OSI. You mentioned you left the Air Force. How long were you out of the Air Force before you applied for the OSI?
About 9 months, I guess, roughly.
Now,
about 9 months.
In 1978, I never asked this beforehand, but again, I wanted to save a lot of the questions for this show. What was the driving factor that you wanted to be part of the OSI?
I had worked with them when I was in the regular Air Force. I'd worked some operations with them. I met some of the agents, and I just became interested in that particular career field within the OSI, within the OSI. So within the Air Force. So I applied, and after a rigorous selection process, I was selected, and I went to their academy.
And you had a ludicrous career, a lucrative career, very good 10 years. So clearly, I'm assuming you had to have enjoyed it to stay there so long, right?
Oh yeah, I did enjoy it. It was a wonderful agency. Let me explain something. That the OSI, the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, is within the Air Force is called a field operating agency. It's not in the regular Air Force. It's a separate operating agency detached from the regular Air Force, and it reports directly to the Secretary of the Air Force. So it doesn't go through any other chain of command. And the agents within OSI are their ranks are special agent, and then they have a particular level of that within OSI. And they're federal agents. All Air Force OSI agents are federal agents, so federal law enforcement agents. And we have to go through a federal law enforcement academy, and then to the OSI academy.
Now, if the OSI, like you said, is literally taking orders from the Secretary of the Air Force, that's directly to the top brass. It's not like you're going through the people in the middle after what you would have been when you were in the regular Air Force, I would think, right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, polygraph, I know that's commonly used now for basically any sort of agency, whether it be the FBI, the CIA, heck, even the LAPD or LASD, where I'm at. Even if you want to be a sheriff's reserve out here, they require you a polygraph. And as someone who went to law school can tell you this, that if polygraphs were really that accurate, we wouldn't need juries. But hey, courts don't accept them, so there is that gray area because clearly they work well enough for the federal government and even the local governments to use that. Now back to you, Mr. Doty. When you were in the OSI, did they give you a particular, like, say, an area to cover? I mean, what I'm trying to get at is, instead of making small talk, is what I'm trying to say is, how did you, within the OSI, started to work on intelligence and counterintelligence involving ETs, extraterrestrials, UFOs?
Well, when I went to the OSI Academy after the Federal Law Enforcement Academy, I went to OSI Academy. They selected so many of us within our class to go into counterintelligence or counterespionage, and I was one of those that was selected, just based on some language knowledge that I have, training I had. I was a German linguist at the time, and so they selected me. And I'd also worked in a regular Air Force intelligence role. So they selected me to go into counterintelligence, and they sent me to counterintelligence, counterespionage school. I went to a DIA course, and that's how I began my career in OSI as a counterintelligence officer.
That's a lot of training, and we've covered in this program people from the FBI, CIA, DIA, NSA, DEA, and so this is remarkable to know that I'm actually speaking to another quote-unquote spy. Would that be the best word of what they trained you to do when you're dealing with intelligence and espionage? Because that's what I generally, and I think the public even thinks intelligence, aka, means spy for the layman.
Well, it's not quite like that. What we do when I was in intelligence, we we weren't the actual spies. What we would do was we would recruit assets. We would recruit people,
yes.
and they were the spies, and we just handled those spies. We handled them.
You
And we would
turned
tell
them.
them what we would.
Right?
Yeah, we turned them and double agents some of them, and we turned them against our enemy. Back in that day, in those days, it was the Soviet Union.
And being a German linguist, Mr. Doty, I would think the Stasi was some of the groups that you were dealing with, the East Berlin Stasi, who most people know really, the Soviet Union was in charge. The KGB was essentially the rule makers and who the Stasi and East Berlin reported to. Can you confirm that? I mean, I'm assuming that's the way most people view it anyhow.
Yeah, well, the Stasi, they operated independently. However, every bit of their information was turned over to the KGB. Now, in some of the Eastern Bloc intelligence agencies, such as the Czech intelligence agency, that was actually run by the KGB. The Hungarian intelligence agency was the same way, and so was in Bulgaria. But the East German intelligence agency, Stasi, and there was several different divisions and bureaus within the Stasi. They were independent. The KGB would let them operate because they were so loyal to the KGB. But every single bit of information that they gathered went directly to the KGB.
That obviously completely makes sense, and I would think that they knew that some of their agents or assets may have turned and were double agents, and in that sense probably wanted to feed some counterintelligence, feed lies, I would think. And from what I gathered, Mr. Doty, is the best way to have a quote-unquote lie or a mashup of facts is you take a giant lie and you surround it by a bunch of small lies, or you take a giant truth and surround it by a bunch of small lies, or a giant lie and surround it by a bunch of small truths. I would think that's how most things work when you're trying to take the truth out of the minds of those who are seeking for it.
Yeah, very well said, Dr. J. That's exactly what we did. We operate in our counter espionage game. We would recruit somebody, and we would think the Soviet or the East Germans or Soviets were thinking that that person was working for them, but in actuality, he was working for us. So when they came back, we would have to give them some real stuff, real information, real intelligence, surrounded by a lot of bull. And then feed that to the opposing intelligence agency. Yes, exactly.
If you were in the OSI from 78 to 88, like you said, this was the Soviet era, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I believe was 89, right? 89, because I know the Soviet Union fall was 1.5, 2 years after the Berlin Wall.
Yes, it was.
So literally your entire career, the main opponent, quote unquote, for the U.S. was the Soviet Union.
That's correct.
Now, let me switch gears a little bit and ask you about your own belief system when it comes to extraterrestrials. What did you believe prior going in there? Because from what I've read, and you were stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, right?
That's correct.
So I'm assuming from the time you joined in 68, you probably heard about what happened at Roswell, as did a lot of people. Did you have any idea one way or another? Did you take the story at face value that it was a weather balloon, or did you think that, hey, something really happened? Or were you one of those people that says, I think there's intelligent life out there, and yet we haven't been visited? Or the third thing, we're alone?
Well, I grew up in a military family. So I had a father who was in the Air Force, and an uncle that was in the Air Force, and cousins who were in the Air Force. And so I traveled around, I moved around with my dad. I was never, in early ages, I was never interested in the subject. My brother, I have an older brother who was immensely interested, immensely involved with the subject of UFOs. He would used to buy the True magazines and read them, and I remember the first book he ever showed me about UFOs was the George Adamski book, the first book that George Adamski wrote. And I was never interested. And when I went into the regular Air Force, I was actually assigned to a very special project up at what people call Area 51. I was actually assigned there for a time period. And although I wasn't briefed into any special programs, I was around the classified projects. I saw things and heard things. People talked about certain things. And so I knew something was going on, but I was never briefed into the program until I joined OSI. And then there was a particular incident that occurred at Kirtland Air Force Base. I was a counterintelligence officer for the base. And then when that incident happened, I was asked to investigate it. And then I was briefed into this special program, which gave me the knowledge of what the government knew and how much the government was involved in UFOs and extraterrestrials.
If you don't mind, first of all, there's a few questions that I could take from this. Going back first to Area 51, I know from documentaries that have come forward about Blackbird, the SR-71 being tested there, and maybe even the U-2, if I'm not mistaken. Did you see craft like that, I would think?
Yeah, I saw the by that time period, the SR-71 was, the U-2 was already developed. The SR-71 was in its final stages of development, and it was highly classified. Every time the plane landed, we would have to guard. They would be escorted into a hangar and sealed up. So that was already in the works. But there were some other elaborate aircrafts being tested out there, and I saw them. They were standard air. They call them non-standard aircraft. They were they were more or less a bat wing style, similar to what you see now or what you saw with the F-117, the stealth fighter.
The triangle.
Back in 1970, 69, 70, they were testing those type of aircrafts out there.
Did you? Because Area 51, a lot of people, there's video games on it. There's, movies have been made about it. The most famous Independence Day, talking about alien craft being there, things like that. Did you already have this preconceived notion? I know you said what your brother believed and you didn't have an interest, but from the moment you arrived at Area 51, did you notice, I guess, the best way to quote this would be, or not quote this, to put this would be, would you say there was more secrecy involved there than in any other Air Force base that you had seen or heard about?
Absolutely. That was the most secretive base the Air Force had. And then back in those days, it was even existence.
I was just going to say, it wasn't even acknowledged till 10 years ago or so, 15 years ago, right? Before that, nobody would acknowledge. The federal government never acknowledged that this is a military installation, let alone being Air Force.
Yeah, it was called, when I was there, it was called the Air Force Test Flight Center Detachment 3, Edwards Air Force Base. And actually, all the administrative control of the base was operated out of Edwards Air Force Base, which is out near you, Dr. J, in California. I'm sure you know about that. And so that was a designation of the base. But you couldn't tell anyone where you worked. You couldn't mention it. If somebody asked you, you told them you worked at Nellis Complex, Nellis Air Force Base Complex in Nevada.
So they literally have a cover story for everything, including to say where your time was.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and even your evaluations, we had to be evaluated every year, or sometimes I guess it was every 6 months. I can't remember now, but the where it said location assigned, it would be the Det-3 Air Force Flight Test Center, Edwards Air Force Base. That's what it would be on the report. So when you move from one duty station to another, they looked at it and they say, "Oh, you were stationed at Edwards Air Force Base. I was there," which in actuality, you were never at Edwards. You were at another location. So it was confusing, but it was very, very, very secretive.
Now, I'm actually surprised, and I can't say I'm that surprised that a lot of the operations were run from Edwards, but I do know how close they are in terms of, planes, say, developed here, would be tested there, and so on and so forth. So you just enlightened me on that whole new subject. Now, back to Area 51, a lot of people even call it Dreamland. Did your perceptions on UFOs change while you were there?
Not the first time. I was there actually twice. I was there once. I was there actually as a counterintelligence officer. While I was in the Air Force in the 80s. While I was with OSI, I mean. And that, of course, I was already had been briefed into the program. But when I was there the first time, the subject came up. We would talk about it in the barracks. The guys would talk about it. Some of our senior enlisted people had been briefed into the program, and there were certain locations on the base that was highly restricted. We had what we call the South Complex down by Papoose.
Oh, like the S4, right? S4 by the Papoose Dry Lake bed. At least that's what one person, Bob Lazar, has labeled it as.
Right, and actually there is a complex there, and there was actually a number of complexes. There was one at the S4, and there was annexes. They call them S4 Alpha Annex, Alpha meaning the phonetic for A in the military terminology, and then this so also Sierra Complex, which was northwest of that, right almost near the border of the Nevada test site, and there was a really secretive location there, and then so only senior enlisted or officer personnel were assigned to those complexes. Now, the only time that we, as the lower enlisted people, could respond to that was if there was some kind of an actual emergency, and then but I never did. I actually never, during my first stay there, I never went down there. We didn't patrol down there. We didn't go down there. We didn't work down there. It was just for the certain section of people within the Air Force. You had to have a special clearance.
You actually opened up a whole new door. I got to say, Mr. Doty, because Mirageman, I don't recall it even mentioning that you worked at Area 51. So this is killing two birds with one stone. And I got to say, I'm really, really honored to be speaking to you for the knowledge you have and agreeing to do this. Real quick, you mentioned the different places, such as the area near the Papoose Lake bed, the Sierra Annex, the Alpha Annex. Were these, I'm assuming, because of the secrecy, so restricted that you didn't have any access, or you did after you were briefed?
Well, when I was stationed there as an OSI agent, I did have access, and I did know what was there, and I was briefed into the programs because I was a counterintelligence officer for that base within the Air Force Special Projects section of OSI, so I knew what was there. But when I was first there, I knew secretive things were occurring down there, but I didn't know. I was never briefed into exactly what those were back in the when I was first stationed there.
If you don't mind, before I get back to Kirtland and the incident and what happened there, if we could stay on the Area 51 for another quick moment or two. If you're allowed to, can you tell us, is there any non-terrestrial activity going on there, or do any non-terrestrial crafts actually exist there?
Yes, they are. Although Bob Lazar, the person who first broke this back in I think 89 or 9, whenever
89,
that was.
yeah.
89.
George Knapp from the KLAS in Nevada, yes.
Yes. Well, a lot of what he says is factual. I mean, but there's some things in there that aren't so factual. The particular administrative accesses into S4, the different levels of S4. I don't recall them being in the same locations that he described them, but they did have on paperwork they called them non-standard or they call them experimental flying machines. Actually, machines, not crafts. But then that was changed somewhat once it got into the air. Then they designated it differently. But I was briefed into the protection program for certain operations. There were a number of projects. I mean, probably, I don't know, 10 or 12, 15 different projects going on at one time. Each craft had a different project associated with it. And they were protected projects, and it was our job at OSI to protect the operational security of those projects. Now, some of those projects were so highly classified that I knew of the project, and I knew that it involved a flying craft, but I didn't know, I didn't have access to where that craft came from, how it was developed, whether it was ours or whether it was somebody else's. Now, the only one that I was actually associated with that I knew came from an extraterrestrial source was a craft involved in a Cash Landrum incident. If you're familiar with that.
Yes, that diamond-shaped craft that caused the radiation.
Yes, that was an actual extraterrestrial craft that I don't know where it came from. I'd never given access to where the craft or how they got it, but it was an extraterrestrial craft. The propulsion system that was on the craft when the U.S. obtained it or found it, the government could never get it to work, so the government substituted a atomic type engine for the original engine that was on it, and they flew it. And they'd flown it for several months around Area 51, up to Tonopah. There's another base north of Area 51 called Tonopah Test Range. And they would fly it all around. And when they thought it was safe to fly, they were going to fly it south towards Texas to a particular base down there. But along the way, once it got into Texas, the craft developed some major problems.
Is that why Betty Cash and Miss Landrum were affected so much because of the problem? Essentially, because they received radiation burns.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. And the craft dropped in altitude and right over the road where they were operating their vehicle, and it spit out the radiation was spit out from the engines, and it affected them. Yeah, it did. The craft never did crash. I mean, there was some reports that the craft crashed, but it never did. It actually got to its location, but there was a lot of rescue helicopters sent because the pilot reported that it was going to crash. And that's why the report of all those helicopters in the air, there were rescue helicopters from various Air Force bases just to make sure the craft didn't crash. And but it got to its location in Texas.
I do know Miss Cash and Miss Landrum did say that following this diamond-shaped object were several Chinook helicopters. I'm assuming were they just trailing this object or to make sure it safely got to where it was because of the problem it was having?
Yeah, they were trailing it because if the craft was going to crash, or if it crashed, then that would become a rescue operation, a search and rescue operation, and the Air Force would have helicopters already in the area to rescue the three. I believe at the time there was 3 pilots in the craft.
Now I'm going to go back to Kirtland Air Force Base, and then by all means, if anything refers back to Area 51, and if you feel like taking any path that aside from what I'm asking you, by all means, you're the guest of honor. The incident, which I believe you said happened prior to your briefing, is that correct, or did the briefing happen before the incident?
No, the incident happened first. A number of incidents happened in the time frame around the late the late 1970s, 1979 into 1980, that involved the sightings of strange objects on or around Kirtland Air Force Base. And one particular object actually landed in a very secure area of the base, and it was observed by a number of Air Force security personnel and by Sandia laboratory security personnel. Yeah. And I was asked to investigate that, and I did. I started an investigation, and I realized this was getting pretty deep into something that I might not have access to. So my supervisor at the time said to me, "You know what, Rick, you need to go, and we're going to have to get you briefed into a special program." And so I went to fill out some paperwork and went to a special location on Kirtland, Air Force Special Security Office. A full bird Air Force colonel flew in from someplace, and there were 6 of us that were placed in a very secure room inside the Air Force Special Security Office, and we were given this briefing regarding the Air Force's involvement with extraterrestrials from 1947 on.
Project Blue Book, essentially. Project Blue Book was 47 to 69 and then ended, and I'm assuming because of what you just told me, the Air Force involvement never really ended, right?
Yeah, the Air Force involvement never. You're exactly right. The Air Force would put out a statement that the Air Force no longer investigates UFOs unless, but in actuality, they never complete it. The Air Force doesn't investigate UFOs unless they occur on an Air Force installation, near an Air Force installation, or involves Air Force property or personnel or aircraft. That's the actual, but what they'll say is we don't investigate those anymore.
Yeah.
But the classified portion of that is that they will investigate if it happens involving or around a military base.
So if it's, for instance, where I live, if something doesn't crash at Edwards or fly near it, it's not going to be investigated, or it will be, as opposed to something that, say, happens in downtown Los Angeles, right?
Yeah, but I guarantee you that there's a classified, highly classified program that's been in place for a long time, probably in the 50s. It's been changed over the years. That involves recovery operations. That if a particular craft like that crashed, an extraterrestrial craft or an unknown type of craft crashed someplace outside military property, there's a federal statute that gives the military authority to declare a defense zone, a Department of Defense zone, a restricted Department of Defense zone. And they come in and make that Department of Defense zone, and therefore they'll recover that whatever's in there, and they'll guard it, and nobody can come in. And then they'll take it out, and then they'll return it to the original owner, whether it's a state land or private land or whatever. But there's a project involving that, and it's been ongoing for years.
I'm assuming that the statute is not something that any Joe Schmo out there can look it up and find out. It's limited to people who have access, I would think, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah, it's because it's classified. It's yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's I used to know the actual statute number, but I over the years I've forgotten it.
Are you allowed to tell us the briefing that you were given after this incident at Kirtland?
Well, I wasn't up until a few years ago. But I tell it. I can tell it. It was a. What the colonel first did was we saw a film. It was a 16 millimeter, whatever it is, whatever the military used, some kind of it was with a projector back in those days. It was a projector with a reel. Anyways, we saw this film. It was narrated by a civilian and a Air Force captain. And it was a specific briefing film for people like us that were going to be briefed into this program. And it started, the film clips that were incorporated into this briefing film were real old, going back to the 40s, showing the crash site at Roswell, the three different crash sites at Roswell, the recovery operation of a crash, two crash discs, where they went, what they found, the live extraterrestrial was located, where that live ET went, how they designated the ET, how long it lived, and then another crash site in 1949 they found out west of Magdalena, New Mexico, and then one in near Aztec. It didn't really go into the great details of that, and how we over the years have found other crafts at locations and had contact with extraterrestrials. Now, it wasn't a deep, detailed briefing. It was just a briefing of what the government knew, what the government has been doing for these years, for a number of years. And then after the briefing, after the movie, after you watch this, I think it was 28 minutes or whatever it was, the colonel would then answer some questions and go into some details about some current operations that were going on regarding extraterrestrials and investigations of them that we might need to know in order to conduct our investigations.
Before I ask you about those other investigations, you mentioned they talked about the ETs and the designation. I'm assuming, is the designation still EBE, Extraterrestrial Biological Entity?
Yes.
And you said they talked about how many years they lived. I'm assuming they showed you pictures or video of them?
Yeah, they did. They showed us pictures. There was one particular segment, or a brief segment, maybe 10 seconds of the actual EBA, EBA 1, they called him. Then it was EBA. That and his next to his handler, which was an Air Force captain, who basically was his handler, and so yeah, they showed several pictures of him.
There's a lot of footage that has come out that is supposed to be from that time range, and I know online exists a photo of some high military brass standing next to an ET. Do you know if anything that you saw is out in the public or leaked out or somehow made it to YouTube or websites, or there's nothing you've seen in that briefing video has ever been released?
Some of it has. Some of it has been segments of what I saw. I've seen online. The actual back in I'd say maybe 2004 or 5, there was a segment. It wasn't under YouTube. It was on a site that I don't believe no longer exists. That showed it was Black Project Site, or I believe that's what the name of the site was, Black Project Site or something to that effect. And this person, whoever it was, the caretaker of the site, had some really legitimate photographs and some segments, small, I mean, like 10 or 15 seconds of film that showed the classified film that I saw, segments of the classified film that I saw back in 1979, 1980.
To my mind, I'm thinking of this. I don't know, not even a minute long, and it shows some discs flying in slow mode. One crashed, and then there's ET footage of what they call Skinny Bob. Have you ever heard that footage, Skinny Bob? I mean, it's pretty famous on YouTube. And the question I'm really asking you, is it true? I mean, do they really look like that, or is that just misrepresentation?
No, they look like the typical, well, the Evens, the one that crashed. It was it looks exactly like the ones that are portrayed on, especially if you go back to the X-Files. Those creatures that are displayed in the X-Files, I think in the third year, looked exactly like the true EBA that we'd had in captivity.
Wow. How many would you say were in captivity while you were there? Or, yeah, exactly. While you were in the OSI, how many EBEs in general would you say were in captivity? Or was that something beyond what you would know, that full bird colonel that was flown in to brief you and the other 5 officers or special agents, actually?
Well, at the time that I'd received that briefing, I only knew of the one that they captured or found and kept in captivity from 47 to I think 52 when it died. I believe it was 52. I only knew of that one during that briefing. That's the only one they told us about. They didn't mention any other extraterrestrial biological entities. Now, once I started investigating different cases, then I learned that we had others that we found or that we captured and that we had at a special location at Area 51. And that was later. And then when I got to Area 51, I actually assigned there later on, and I still have my badges regarding the Area 51, because there was a particular person who doubted that I had ever been there, and when I produced the badge and showed the badge, he disappeared on the internet. So anyway, I knew of several, and a lot of that is still somewhat classified. I was never actually briefed into a program, but because of a particular incident that happened in 1983, where a ET escaped, I was briefed into the program by my supervisor there. I wasn't officially briefed in. You're not going to find any documents say that I was regarding. There's several documents out there that have been circulated for years that shows that I'd been briefed into a number of different programs. But because of this thing that had happened, my boss there at Area 51 briefed me into the program. So then I had access to that.
If you don't mind me asking, and if you could tell, by all means, again, classification is still classified. Are you able to tell us how this particular ET escaped? You
know what? I I don't know the exact circumstances behind it. I know the location where they were housed, which was north. I told you about Sierra site.
Yes,
That area there,
northwest.
northwest of Papoose Lake, was where they were housed. It was a partially underground facility, heavily guarded, a number of different fences, and they had some unique security measures that they built in to keep these things from escaping. But I don't know the exact method used to escape. I don't know if it was being transported or what. I don't know that. I never had access to that.
Did they ever tell you about how these creatures communicate? Because the word from a lot of researchers and people who have been taken contact is telepathy.
Yes. I've and again, I was never briefed into anything special that told me this, but I had a number of people tell me that's exactly how they communicated, because none of these creatures, and I know of, there were, I think, 6 or 7 different types. None of them knew English. they didn't learn English, and they didn't have any earthly language abilities. Some of them communicated only through whispers and sounds, some strange sounds, like the Ebens. The one they captured, he could make noises, and but they were, unintelligent to us. We couldn't understand it. But I think I read, well, in the briefing they told us that at some point some doctors developed a method to implant a voice box into the alien, the EBA-1, and so he was able to communicate. And he actually learned, I was told, I read this, that he was able to learn English rather quickly. I mean, crude English, not fluent English, but he was able to communicate. Very smart. And this particular creature had an IQ of like 200 or something.
Wow.
Compared to
we
were there. So he was and he was a mechanic. He wasn't a captain or a scientist. He was just a mechanic. But he had such a high IQ that he was able to grasp our language. But unfortunately, he died, and I was never told or read anything, the reason why he died, but he died in, I think it was 52.
You already actually answered a question before I even asked it, which was the different types. You mentioned 6 or 7. Can you describe for us what the different types of ETs look like?
The only ones that I know, the only pictures that I have ever seen, are of the Eben, that is a typical Eben, the gray colored, short, about 4 foot tall, no ears, just an indentation for a nose, small mouth, big eyes, long arms. That's the Eben. And now there was one called a Trantaloid, and I'm not sure who named these or how they were named. It was DIA or who named them. But and this thing was quite hideous looking. It kind of looked like a praying mantis. It had a head like a praying mantis, but it was about 5.5 foot tall, or 5.5 foot tall. Had strange appendices for arms. Had web-like feet. And then they had another one, and I don't recall what it was called, but it was. Had almost it was a similar size of the Eben, but it was small. It was single size, but the face was more human-like than Eben. The eyes weren't as big, and the ironic thing about it is, I was told, again, I've never had access to these creatures, but what I was told is that none of them could communicate with each other. They didn't have any special, but some of them had the telepathic powers. And I learned this years ago, after I had gotten out of OSI, and I was just a civilian. we would have meetings. I was a member of the retired intelligence officer association, and we would have meetings once a year or twice a year. And within that group, there was a small number of us, smaller now because they're dying off, but there was a small number of us who had been briefed into the program, and we would meet more frequently. And we would sit at a hotel or someplace in a somewhat secure location, and we would exchange stories, exchange information. So I learned a great deal about the subject then, which was years after I got out, regarding the different types of creatures and how they were captured. And there was actually an incident sometime in the middle 70s in around Washington, D.C., where a ET was, I don't know the exact reason, but it was taken to Washington for a particular reason, and then it escaped in the Washington D.C. area, and that was a nightmare for the intelligence community and the officers. They eventually found the creature in some canal, and then whisked it back to Area 51, but. And I never knew that while I was in. I heard about this later on. And I think there was a book written some years ago about this. It was a science fiction book, but it was actually portraying the actual event. But I tell you, somebody that knows a lot, somebody that had a great deal of good sources within DIA is Linda Howell.
Yes.
She's one of the best. I know I'm somewhat of an adversary of the two of us, but she's one of the best researchers out there. She has so many important and legitimate sources within the government, DIA, CIA, military intelligence, that's telling her information that is right on. In fact, one of the reasons, if we want to change the subject and go back to Linda Howell a minute, one of the reasons that I was tasked with contacting her is because she had spoken with a person within Air Force intelligence about a very, very highly classified project. And she was aware of that project. And we wanted to know where she got that information. And so one of the reasons that I invited her in and gave her the briefing paper, and which was, showed her it to her and let her read it. One of the real reasons was that we wanted to try to recruit her into letting us know, or trying to find out who her sources were. But unfortunately, it didn't work out right for us. She was too crafty she realized it at some point. I mean, I had maintained a professional relationship with her. I would meet her someplace in Washington or talk to her about this and that. And she would, I think, consider me as a source. But in actuality, I was trying to recruit her as one of our sources to try to find out who this person was. We did find out later, it took us some time. We did find out who her source was within DIA, but it was some years later.
So it was DIA, in fact, that was the source.
It was DIA. Yeah, absolutely, it was DIA. And she had not just one, but she had a couple really, really high-level sources within DIA.
Before I go back to some of the things she says, and then obviously I want to go back to some of the stuff you say, let me ask you this, if you know. Do you know why the DIA in particular would handle these affairs with involving ETs?
They, I don't know the specific reason, but one of my very, very, very good friends who is very elderly, but he worked in the intelligence arena at the same time I did. He was in DIA, and he was actually one of our instructors in the DIA school. And I became very, very, very good friends with him. And when he retired, he retired first, and then I retired later. And then we met and continued for meeting over the years at, unfortunately at funerals or just these retired intelligence officer association meetings. He told me that DIA at one point, that the Air Force gave up on the subject. They didn't want to in the late 60s. The Air Force, the Condom Report. I'm sure you know about that.
Yes,
the Air Force had to get out of this, publicly get out of it, and so the Air Force didn't really want to get involved. Well, DIA comes along, and now DIA was a relatively new agency. Had been around about 8 or 9 years. They came in existence in about 1960, I believe. They volunteered for it. This is what he told me. They hey, we'll do it. And then that's why the DIA got involved, and they became the record keepers and for it. And I know even today they're still doing it.
That's very interesting because the DIA official that I know, he was only privy to one incident. I don't know how long he worked in the DIA, but he was pretty aware of what happened, but in one place, in Afghanistan in particular. Now, before I come back to some of these questions I have, Mr. Doty, there's been some listener questions that have been sitting here, so if you don't mind, they might take us back a little bit, but I don't want to sort of deny these people, unless you don't want to take them, of course. It's up to you.
I didn't hear. I didn't catch that. There were what questions?
Listeners.
Oh, listeners. Listen. Oh, sure.
Okay. Sure. Here's the first one. Has any EBIN been working with the intelligence till this day? And how many species of ET have been working with the intelligence? You mentioned the second answer already, but the first answer is first question is how many has EBIN been working with intelligence till this day?
Well, I only know one, and again, there could be many that I had never been briefed into, but I know of one, and his code name was J-Rod.
Yes, I've actually heard that. Yes, I've actually heard that J-Rod from the one official who worked with him, but some people don't necessarily. Some people go on either side of that story of whether or not they believe the J-Rod story of the person, and the name eludes me, of it was some biologist, a PhD, who dealt with him, Dr. Dan Burisch. That's where I heard the name J-Rod. Have you ever come across that name, Dr. Burisch?
Yes, I have.
Interesting. Yeah, okay, so you actually just verified.
I have, and that's an entirely different. I mean, we could talk about that for you, but no, there was Dr. Burisch. I know of him, but J-Rod. While I was at Area 51 working there was a van that left the Sierra site every morning. A specialized blue van, had a box trailer in the back of it, huge box trailer, and it would go down to to S4, and it would drive inside. Now, you're not supposed to take vehicles inside S4 because the carbon monoxide and so forth. But this was allowed to go into a certain area and stop, and you really had to have a special access badge to get into that. I was never in there. I never had access to it. And I asked an intelligence person who was working there. Actually, he was a scientist. He was in the intelligence community, but he was an actual scientist. I said, "What's in that van?" And back in 1983 or 84, this was about the time frame. He said, "Oh, that's J-Rod." And I left it at that. I didn't ask him. I thought, well, J-Rod, is that a team that means something? JROD. I mean, an abbreviation or an acronym. I did. And then when I got back to the office, one of my bosses who had been there for several years, I asked him. I said, "Who's J-Rod?" And he said, "Where the hell did you get that?" And I said, "Well, I just wondered." He said, "That's you're not briefed into that." And so I just left it at that. So I know there was one, and now there could be others, and I've heard over the years that were others, but not from any official sources.
Phil, it's just fantastic you're able to verify stories that some people were able to tell, but they couldn't provide proof because of all the secrecy involved. So this is just truly fantastic, Mr. Joey. Okay, go ahead.
I have something to add real quick. Wendell Stevens, the late Wendell Stevens.
Yes.
I was at, and this was probably in the 2004, 5, 6 time frame. I was at the UFO convention when it was still being held at Laughlin, and Wendell Stevens and I became friends. And Wendell Stevens invited several of us up to his room, and he had a video, or actually it was an old film, like a 8mm film. I can't remember what millimeter, but it was on one of those old that you had to have a projector to show. And he showed us a film of J-Rod.
Stevens.
Wendell Stevens. I don't know where he got it from, but there was about 11 of us in this room, 8 or 11 of us in this room, that he showed us the actual film, this old military film of J-Rod and what J-Rod looked like. And now J-Rod didn't look like Eva. J-Rod looked entirely different. He was a very strange looking alien, had a very protruding jaw and almost a hideous looking type of, but apparently, according to Wendell Stevens, he was a brilliant ET scientist from one of our close star groups, and so he'd been on Earth for a number of years, and he's very smart and helped us with the propulsion systems and so forth of the craft. This is coming from Wendell Stevens, though.
Still, he's been involved intimately. I remember from Alaska, I think, is when he got his start in the Air Force, getting the film from each time something happened about once a month or so. And then he started collecting pictures. I always, and he is resting in peace right now. I always considered him to be one of the great sources, even though, again, Mr. Doty, it's how someone like me who's been, looking at this passively until I got involved proactively 7 years ago to really say, okay, hey, I can compare this story. I can verify it from this source. I mean, most of us can't, and I know you know this. Let me get to the other questions here real quick. This is from the same lady. This is Katerina Luna Di Camilla. I hope I said that properly. She says, are there any other governments besides the U.S. working with ETs that you know of?
No, I don't officially know. I was stationed in Europe after I left Kirtland. I was a counter-espionage officer in Germany, and one of our tasks was to try to obtain that particular type of information from Soviet spies, East German spies, and what that was one of the essential elements of information that we were to ask them. And we had a particular double agent within the Soviet military who was a captain, a military captain, who was actually working inside Germany. He was assigned to the Soviet liaison mission, which they were allowed to have inside Germany after the war, and we were allowed to have our mission inside East Germany. Anyways, he told us that he knew of the Soviet program that they had captured two ETs back in the 50s, I guess, and they were working with him, but unfortunately both of theirs died. But I knew of that, but I don't know of any others.
I do know, at least, or I can't say again. When I say no, Mr. Doty, it's just from what other people have told me. Joseph Stalin, apparently the reaction he had after learning that we had captured the wreckage of Roswell was so adamant that he has his own program, that the orders, just like we had back in the I think the early 50s, I don't know when the order of shoot to kill or to destroy the craft ended. I know a lot of pilots lost their lives, but I'm assuming you might have known that Joseph Stalin really wanted this, and that's probably how he ended up with some of this involvement with these EBEs himself.
Yeah, I knew Stalin. I knew Khrushchev had put out an order too. One of the interesting stories. I'm friends with a former KGB agent. He lives here in New Mexico. he came to the United States in the 90s, and he was a KGB officer during Brezhnev era, but he told me a story when Francis Gary Powers was shot down in 1960, in May 1960. Khrushchev was told, the first briefing that Khrushchev got was, we got one of those flying saucers.
Interesting. Even though it was a U-2.
Yeah, it was a U-2. That was the first briefing he got. And then shortly after, an hour or so later, they came in and told him, no. It's one of those secret. The Soviets didn't know it was U-2. It was a spy plane. And then they said, no, it's a U-2 spy plane. And we captured the pilot and so forth. But this KGB former KGB officer, who I'm very good friends with, I meet with him a couple times a month in Albuquerque for coffee or something, and he tells me interesting stories, and I tell him interesting stories. But I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah. I mean, literally, considering you guys were adversaries a couple decades ago, and now we have the FSB, and I really don't think that's changed much for the KGB, but hey, who am I to say, right? Here's another question. This comes from across the Atlantic pond. I want to say, I hope the name is properly Steve James. And Mr. Doty, I hope you understand what he's referring to. So let me just go ahead and read it. It says, what's your opinion on the Utah drone footage, if you know what he's talking about?
Yes, I know. I saw it. I'm not a photo interpreter. I'm not an expert in that area. I've watched that thing a number of times. I saw the analysis on YouTube. I saw a number of different people analyzed it. I have some questions about whether that could actually be a craft large enough. It could be a smaller craft. It could be a drone. The government, I know that the government, the United States government, the United States Air Force, is experimenting with these high-speed drones. They're testing them actually up in Tonopah, and we had a unique experience. Myself and another person, we were up there just last year in October. I was actually helping a location shoot for a film that's going to come out maybe next year. But anyways, we were about a mile north of the perimeter of Tonopah. We saw this object go over our heads. It was flying at an incredible speed, but we could actually see it. And I thought, my God, and it didn't have any sound.
That's what I was going to say. Is it credible speed? Do you mean supersonic speed? And if it doesn't have any sound, then that's even more bizarre.
It was supersonic, and it was probably not more than 1,000 feet above us. Wow. And we looked at that thing, and it's too late for us to get a picture because we didn't have our cameras ready. So we thought, well, north of Warm Springs, Nevada, there's an Air Force complex called the Base Camp, and it's an Air Force installation that is very secretive, but it's open. I mean, you could drive right up to the gate and look and watch the runway. So we immediately drove up, and it was about 15 miles, and we drove up there thinking that this thing might have landed there. And we drove up, we parked outside, and we were looking in with binoculars, and we saw this thing on the runway. It's not more than maybe 6 foot long, and there was trucks around it and people around it, and it was just parked there. And what they were doing was they were taking it apart. We was hoping that it would take off again so we could take a picture, but I never did it. They apparently took it apart. And so I know the Air Force is experimenting with these things. I don't know if they could be that small. I don't know that, but it's very possible.
Now here's one of ours. I mean, that obviously is definitely something we always have to consider, but the fact that it's going that darn fast, it begs the question, is it something that we created in secret from the technology that we recovered, because general physics will tell you that it's impossible to cut through the sky or the air without making a sonic boom if you're going at those speeds. So that's where it sort of borderlines like, well, where the heck did this technology come from?
I agree. And that's what shocked us. And it didn't make a sound. So what kind of propulsion system is on that thing? That's the thing I scratched my head about. What the heck is that? But anyway, that's the only thing that I could relate to that could possibly be some kind of a really secret Air Force drone project.
You actually touched on propulsion, which was something I wanted to ask you. So we'll get back to that in a second. Let me finish some of these questions. This one is I'm going to skip one because it has to do with Linda. Before we get to that, this one is kind of got two parts to it, meaning that the person that it's going to ask it's the other part of the question. So let me read it to you. What about Valiant Thor from Phil Schneider? And the second part would be, what do you think of Phil Schneider's story with the Dulce Air Force Base or Dulce underground base?
Well, Valiant Thor, I read about it. I never saw anything official while I was in the Air Force about that person and whether he actually existed. So I was never briefed. If there was such a person and it was classified, I was never briefed into it. So I don't have any information on that. As far as the Dulce base, there is an actual base there. There was a base, I should say, back in the 80s when I was stationed at Kirtland. I know it was a Special Forces base. It would train Special Forces personnel up there. Now, as far as any underground facility, I don't have any knowledge of that. I heard people speak about it. I heard a DIA official speak quite in length about it at one of our meetings once, verifying that there were 4 or 5 levels down there. But I personally never had any knowledge or access to that.
And what we just mentioned, Mr. Doty, about the different levels. That's actually what I've heard myself too. One person, Anthony Sanchez, claims in a book he wrote that a colonel told him about this, and then he agreed just to never tell the colonel's name. So obviously you couldn't cross-reference it. But he did mention there being, I believe he said, 6 levels, where the bottom 2 were completely extraterrestrial, off limits to us. The third one below was one that was sort of joint, and then the above 3 were ours. But like you said, if you can't verify it, then we're still got to be bewildered with that. Now let me get to this, because this is going to open the door from not just what I'm going to ask, what this listener's asking you, but what I wanted to ask you when you mentioned Linda. It's this is again from Katarina. From Linda Moulton House says, World War II was extraterrestrial fight through human? ? What do you think about that statement?
World War II?
World War II being fought for about ETs, essentially, is what I'm assuming is what it's.
I know where she's coming from. I know the person. There's a couple of different people. One particular, John Alexander, a colonel.
Yes, Colonel John Alexander. Yes.
Yeah, he had somebody that talked about that. One of his friends, and I had other people. Clarence Voigt. I don't know if you know Clarence, who was a historian. U.S. military. He taught, I believe, at West Point or Annapolis. He taught at one of the military academies for years. He was a historian. He spoke of that, and he had an actual paper he wrote for, I believe it was the Air War College or one of the military academies, where he, because of the Foo Fighters and these other things, he connected the two. But I don't have any personal knowledge of that.
Now, this actually, like you said, and again, see that having no knowledge of that just again shows the different levels and how you're able to verify certain things and other things. Because I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Doty, that this topic is very compartmentalized, even within the OSI.
Oh,
and DI.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't have full access to every single thing. I mean, there were a lot of things. I mean, I was sitting in an office in Nevada where there's 4 other OSI agents, a boss, and then 3 others. Excuse me, there's 4 of us total. And my boss was working on things that I didn't have access to.
Wow.
So I know he went out and did things and collected them, and he would go into the secure room and use our secure encryption center to encrypt the information into a report and send it out. And I would go in after him, but I wouldn't have access to anything he had. I would be, doing my work. And so, yeah, it's very compartmented. I mean, the entire government is so compartmented with knowledge that when you cross that threshold from one particular project to another, it's like going from daylight to darkness, and you're in the dark and you're saying, well, I don't know what this is. So now you have to go to somebody, your boss or the security officer, and say, hey, I'm working on this project and I don't know what it is. Can you help me? So then you get access to it. You get partial. I mean, there's different types of access. You can get limited access. You can get complete access. You can get partial access, so you can complete your investigation. But you don't get, very rarely do you get complete access to everything. I mean, I don't know very many people that did get complete access to everything.
Even some people claim, like you mentioned, groups. Some people claim that even MJ-12, the group that governed, depending upon those who believe it or not, even outside of them, no one had complete access. And I don't even know if they technically did. I think they might have. Do you know anything about MJ-12, Majestic 12?
Well, Dr. J, yes, that's a legitimate. I read that. That was in the briefing document. There's actually there was. I mean, I don't know if it exists today, but there was it was a Majestic. It was Majestic 12 that I read about, and somehow I don't know if somebody abbreviated over the years or it became on MJ-12, but it was Majestic 12. That's what I read, and I was briefed on back in the early 80s. There was a number of documents I read over the years, or a particular briefing I had in Washington a couple years after I got my initial briefing, where they mentioned Majestic 12.
Majestic. So those Majestic. So and I remember a lot of people were saying, "Oh, Magic, top secret, Magic, MAJIC," as opposed to MAGIC. They were wondering about that, of course. Majestic. Are you saying that those briefing documents, the so-called MJ-12 papers, were in fact real? Are you able to confirm that?
Well, I can confirm that the contents in those documents are real. I can't confirm that the documents that were released by Bill Moore or Jamie Shandera were, in fact, the real documents. But the information contained in there is, in fact, real. I mean, and I think that's been. There's been so many people, legitimate people. There was a particular colonel. Unfortunately, he died some years ago. I can't think of his name, but Colonel Leah or something like that.
So that was 2 decades ago.
No, not Orso. No. It was a Colonel. Anyways, he confirmed, and back in the late 90s or something. I can't remember exactly when it was, but he confirmed that this is real. Actually, it was before that. It was when the Air Force released the stuff about Roswell, which was a bunch of baloney. Right after that, this colonel came forth, and I think he spoke on some. I don't know. Maybe it was. I don't know if it was Art Bell or I don't remember now what show it was on, but he spoke about it, and then everybody downplayed it, saying he didn't really know. He didn't really have access. But I know that the information in there is absolutely, most of it, I should say most of it. There may be some information in there that I don't remember, I didn't have access to, but reading that document, the briefing document, that's real stuff. That's real information.
That's fantastic that you're actually really able to talk about that and to verify. These questions keep on piling. I hope that's okay with you, because I still had more that I wanted to get to. And I am going to return back to some of the stuff about Linda, but let me just get to some more here. Someone did ask a question that you did answer. I'm assuming this person got on early, but Carmen Smith, the second part of the answer. Do you know anything about them working with governments to make ET/human hybrids?
No, I have no information on that. If that program existed, I never had access to it.
Now, let's find this one question that I've been sitting on. Okay. According to Dr. Jacobs and Bud Hopkins and many abductees, there is an ET program which they are creating human/ET hybrids. Is this true? Thanks, Dr. J and Richard. I'm assuming that's exactly what you just answered to.
Yeah, I don't know about that. During my early days in OSI, I was never briefed into anything to do with abductions. In fact, I didn't believe them. I didn't think that they really were. I was actually involved in one. The Myra Hansen case, which is something we can talk about later. And in another case that I had actually investigated. But I didn't know what the government knew until years later when I was out of OSI, where some of the DIA people said, hey, there's really a program. I mean, this is really happening. This is a real phenomenon. And I said, and I probably had to apologize to a lot of people, because I told people over the years when I was in OSI, that's a bunch of baloney. That doesn't exist. But in actuality, it does.
It was happening. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, and the government knew about it, and the government actually had a program. It was Project. What was it? Double something. Anyways, it was actual project the government was involved with, and the FBI was involved with it, and trying to figure out how they're doing it and where these people go. And yeah, I mean, but I didn't learn about that until after I got out.
Now, here is yet another one, and this goes to, it says, does Mr. Doty know anything about Project Serpo, the exchange program between ET and the military?
Back in 2005 or 6, whenever that first came out, I was accused of leaking that. I was accused of creating it, but that's absolutely false. I learned about this from a guy by the name of Victor Martinez. He had a stream, extraterrestrial stream, where he would send stuff out, and I actually met him. I actually had applied to a law school out in Whitaker, California.
Yes. Whittier. Whittier.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Whittier. Yeah. Anyways, and I met with Victor, and then I started doing my own investigation, asking around, asking my colleagues within the intelligence community that I saw contact with. Some of them said, we really did have a program, and some said, no, it was a program on paper, but it never actually got off the ground. And then some said, no, we do. And then we went and we actually met with a guy in Phoenix, down in, outside Phoenix, Sun City, we're suburb of Phoenix, where he was supposedly the last survivor of the group. And so we went down there, myself and some others, including Kit Green and some other people, and we actually were able to sit down and talk with this guy. He was like 90 years old, very old. But he told us it was factual, and he told us a lot of information. And then there was a guy by the name of Yeager who lived out in Oceanside, California. Mm-hmm. He lived right outside the perimeter of Pendleton. And
yes, Marine base, yes.
Yeah, the Marine base. Anyways, he had these tapes, these old disc tapes where you'd listen to them, and they were supposedly survivors recounting their story, and there were hours and hours and hours and hours of these guys talking about what they experienced. Now, where did that come from? I mean, I wasn't around back in those days. I mean, I was just a young kid, so I wasn't in the military, and I had, like I said, talked to people who said yes, it's true, and then some had said nah, it's not true. So, the jury's still out on that. I don't know for a fact whether it's real or not. But somebody made a lot of money on it.
Yeah, either way, Mr. Doty, you've really confirmed a lot for me, and this is so fantastic. We have literally 20 minutes, less than 20 minutes before we have to get off air, and there's so many more questions I have to ask you, and there's still more coming from the listeners. So let me go to this one, because this is one, as a matter of fact, prior to coming on air, I actually mentioned about this, and this is from Carmen Smith. She asks, how about Paul Bennewitz? Any of that story true? And I guess I might as well open the whole door to what happened to Paul.
Yeah, Paul Bennewitz, that story is actually true. Paul Bennewitz he owned a company outside Kirtland Air Force Base, Thunder Scientific Laboratories. He was a physicist. He lived in the Four Hills area of Albuquerque, which is right outside the base perimeter of Kirtland Air Force Base. He saw lights flying around the base. He took pictures. He actually developed a computer program, and he started his own investigative work on UFOs. But at one point, he thought because of what he was collecting, there was a danger to Kirtland Air Force Base. So he went out in 1980. He approached Major Ernie Edwards, and Major Edwards was the commander of the Air Force Security Police Force that guarded Manzano storage area. And back in those days, Manzano storage area was the largest nuclear weapon storage area in the world. And it was actually inside Manzano Mountain on Kirtland. So when Paul Bennewitz reported this to Major Edwards, he immediately turned around and reported it to me, because I was a counterintelligence officer in the base. And I began an investigation. And the investigation encompassed a lot of time and effort on my part, and a lot of time and effort on other agencies' parts. But Paul had struck, he actually tapped into something. He tapped into a couple different things. He tapped into was a very highly classified National Security Agency project that was occurring on Kirtland Air Force Base. Now, over the years, this has been declassified, so I can tell you about it. The Air Force, or NSA, in conjunction with the Air Force, had developed a way to blind Soviet satellites as they were flying over the United States. They would shoot a laser up at it, and it would temporarily blind the satellite, so as it was passing over, it couldn't take pictures, or the pictures that were being taken didn't come out clear. And Paul Bennewitz had actually tapped into that. So somehow he did that.
Into the laser, you mean?
Yeah, he tapped into the communication system that was being used by the National Security Agency.
Wow.
And so, and Paul was a brilliant man. And so, because he did this, we couldn't go and tell Paul, hey, you just tapped into a classified project. So we had to try to convince Paul that what he did was actually involving UFOs. And we didn't have to really enforce his belief. He already believed in UFOs. He'd already done 5 years of studies on UFOs. He'd already been a member of APRO. And he wrote papers about UFOs. So he believed that what he was seeing and what he was doing was really UFOs. So I didn't have to feed him any great disinformation. All I had to do was agree with him. You know what, Paul? Geez, what you got? That sure it does look like UFO related. That's all I had to do. I mean, I didn't have to And over the story that came out that I provided him all this different information, and I made him go crazy. It's a bunch of baloney. Paul was a chain smoker. He smoked probably 5 or 6 packs a day, and they were the root builder type of cigarettes. He drank probably 5 or 6 quarts of Coca-Cola a day. He didn't have a great appetite. He was a very slender, skinny type of guy, and he was and we became friends over the years, him and I. But what he did do, he had developed this computer program. Actually, part of that program was given to him by Dr. Hynek. Dr. Hynek came and
Alan
visited
Hynek,
Paul.
yes.
Yeah, and he gave him this crude computer system and the program. But Paul was an amateur programmer, and he had people in his lab that were actual, Cobalt and Fortran computer programmers back then. So, anyway, he developed this. Well, he called me one day, and I went over to his house, and he said, "I got this on my computer. What is it?" And he had an actual picture of an extraterrestrial. Now, I don't know how he got
Bennewitz did. Interesting.
Paul Bennewitz did. So then I started thinking, geez, maybe Paul has really got onto something here. Maybe he actually, tapped into something that was ET related. That's when NSA took over. And NSA paid Paul, put him on a contract, $135,000. He was paid initially a $75,000 contract, and then they gave him 60 more,
yeah.
60,000. Well, actually, it was actually a little bit more than that, because they gave him 75, and they gave him a 5,000 for something entirely different, and then they gave him a 60,000. So it was about $140,000 they gave him on a contract, and then he basically started working for NSA. I mean, he was contracted to them to do some certain things that was quite unique. For that, and he already had a government contract. His company, Thunder Scientific, they made environmental sensors for submarines, nuclear power submarines, and humidity sensors, and he also made some type of a sensor. I think it was a humidity sensor for a spacecraft.
So I would have thought he might have had some clearance then, right? Would you be able to confirm? Okay.
He had a what they call an industrial security clearance. He was given his facility was given an industrial security clearance. It was just a simple secret clearance in order to work on these projects, and everybody in his lab, in his office, had to have the same security clearance. And there was another peripheral operation that we ran against Paul, which had anything to do with Paul. It was one of his employees that we thought might have been selling information to the Soviets, but that's not something entirely different. But Paul, over the years, believed it. Eventually, his contract expired. We quit investigating him. I became still friends with him. When this was all over with, I told Paul that most of whatever he was doing was related to a classified project. I told him it wasn't really UFOs. He didn't believe me. He wouldn't believe me.
He still thought it was UFO.
And then he wouldn't. He said he still thought it was UFO. So that's what happened. And Paul signed every single kind of clearance and waivers, boilerplated waivers that we could sign. We could have him sign when we were investigating him, and when we were doing this project, and he did the same for NSA. So he could never come back and sue us. I know his family tried to at one time when he passed away, but we were covered by all the different things he signed, and he remained friends with me right up. I mean, I saw him 4 days before he passed away, and he actually called. His son called me and said, his son didn't like me. He said, "My dad wants to see you." And so I went up there and I talked to Paul for, he was in pretty bad condition, but, I talked to him for probably 15, 20 minutes. That was the last time. I said goodbye to him, and he passed away 4 days later. But he was always a friend of mine.
There's the questions from the listeners, Mr. Doty, they come first before mine. So let me get as many in before the rest of the show, because we have under 10 minutes. So this is from @Jacob. Has any government captured or had any contact with tall grays? If so, what's the difference between tall and short grays?
I don't have any knowledge. I don't have any official knowledge of whether the government captured any creatures. I was never briefed in any programs regarding that, so I couldn't answer that.
Okay, this is another one. How much longer the secrecy about the ET the government intends to keep away from us, and is there any timeline this may come out? And what does Mr. Doty think? So I literally read it word for word.
I think that there is there's going to be a time period where this information is going to be released. I think they are slowly thinking about it. They're slowly realizing that they're going to have to, because I know that there's been cases where ETs actually presented themselves, and it's going to happen again. It's going to be where there's thousands and thousands of people who are going to be present. So, and the government's going to have a real red face if they don't release this information. I know at one point I read in the briefing documents back in the late 70s, where the government actually had a program that they were going to release, condition the public for a release of this. And at some point along the way, it never happened. But the government at some point realized that they couldn't release it. And then there's some reasons why they can't. And one of the main reasons why, what would happen if for some reason they connect the visitation of Earth 2,000 years ago with Jesus, and the connect Jesus to a spaceman? What would happen to religion? Those are the reasons that I know of, that they probably won't release everything.
You actually answered one of my questions, which was why the secrecy, and I guess this is exactly what this listener said, because I was going to ask you about the timeline of how many thousands of years ago had they been here. And I've always assumed that Jesus, was possibly part extraterrestrial or something like that, involving that whole story. Even though I am Christian, I always believe that to an extent. But so anyhow, I'm glad you mentioned that. So 2,000 years, real quick, before I go back to these other real quick questions. How far back have you been told? Because I know Linda says 250 million years, and I know Bob Lazar said, I believe, 10,000 years.
The briefing document said thousands. It didn't say 2000s. 2000. I distinctly remember reading it went back thousands. Evens have been coming to our planet for thousands of years, and we have and he related it to certain things that have occurred on Earth. Now there's such a thing as a yellow book. I don't know if you've heard about the yellow book.
Yes, that was the time viewing device, I believe.
Yeah, I never had access to it, but I've talked to numerous people that had, and it's just absolutely fascinating. You can sit there and look through it, and it just relates the whole history, and it never seems to end. I mean, there were some people who sat there for hours and hours and hours, and unfortunately, when you take, as I was told, when you take it away from you and come back to it, it starts over again. It doesn't. You can't. There's no way to stop it to where you last saw it. So I don't know if anybody actually got through the whole thing.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine, especially if it's got that long in it too. Okay, let me get a couple more of these in. Let's see here. This is just a quick request. Can we see? This is from just a moniker of aliens. Can we see tapes of grays and stuff? I know you mentioned earlier that you'd seen some on the web, and I mentioned some that I'd seen on the internet, but I don't know how late into the show this listener caught on, but just to appease them, I wanted to make sure he's acknowledged. I'm assuming it's he, at least.
There are some. I mean, it's been a while since I actually did a search on YouTube or on the internet, but I know that at some point, some years ago when I did this, there were some legitimate pictures. There's one showing an extraterrestrial in a room, a dark room, and he's kind of walking around. That's real. I I know that was real. And it's short, maybe a minute or two. And he has a suit on, and
the skinny Bob. The skinny Bob footage I was telling you about. Black suit, very skinny, and he sort of seems to be walking, right? That's what I was referring to earlier.
Yeah.
So that is real.
That's real. That's absolutely real. And there's another one that was on some years ago showing an Air Force or a military officer, I don't know if he was Air Force, standing next to a terrestrial, and there was it looked like it was in some kind of an office. That's EBA. That's a picture of EBA 1 in Los Alamos, where he actually lived for a number of years. That picture, it was that was taking a screenshot from a film that I saw.
That's what I was going to say. I had seen a screenshot of that. So you're saying it was a film?
Yeah, it's a film. It's actually a film, and showing this creature, and on the internet, somebody had gotten some screenshots and posted them, and I don't know. I haven't, like I said, I haven't been on the internet looking for these in a long time, so I don't know. I'm sure they got to be still there somewhere.
No problem. And I appreciate I'm sure the listener appreciates this answer, and the fact that you verified that skinny bug footage is in fact real, and so is that picture of the Eben standing next to the military officer. Again, this is just fascinating. Okay, let's see you here. This one question I'm going to revert to as sort of the last question. So here's one about Nordics. It says, is there any truth to the existence of tall, blonde Nordic aliens?
Not that I know of. And I've never seen or read anything official regarding the Nordics. And they maybe exist, and I just didn't have access to it, but I've never seen anything in any kind of classified documents that would describe the Nordics. I know what they're talking about. I've seen mentioned, but I personally have never seen or anything in any kind of documents. And again, maybe I didn't have access to it.
Okay, real quick, I'm going to ask this one question before I get to this final question from the listener, which I think really would encompass a lot. What do you believe to be the intention? I know we have just a couple minutes, but if you could briefly, or if you don't, hey, who can really at this point, I guess, of them visiting us is the question.
Space exploration. The EBA 1 told us that. He told us that they had thousands of crafts that are exploring the universe, and this particular group that he was involved with came to our solar system, knew we were here because they had visited us a number of times, and would come back and check on our progress over the years. So so it's space exploration. He never mentioned any kind of a covert or a malicious reasons for coming here, or stealing our ozone layer, or stealing anything like that. He never mentioned that I was aware of that. Now, some of these other races, I've been told, one of the Trantiloids, one of the ugly looking ones, they were the ones that were here to steal our DNA. But
so they had evil intent, in essence.
Yeah, they had evil intent. And I only knew that. I've read that in an official document, but I didn't actually have access to the entire program.
Now, this is the last question I'm going to ask from the listeners, considering we're really close to the time, Mr. Doty. Okay, again, this one's from Katerina. She's been very patient with this one question. What was the reasons that made Mr. Doty come forward to open up this info? I know this might take more than a couple minutes, but whatever you can in the short time, and I would love to bring you back because there's so much more to talk about.
Well, my attitude over the years have changed drastically. I was a pro-government. I was pro protection of this information. But then I realized that the public really needs to know the truth. There's so much out there that is false. There's so much information out there that is absolutely 100% false. And I'm tired of reading a book, reading some kind of UFO book about some guy that wants to sell money. He never been in the military, never been in intelligence, but he's writing this book and saying, this is how it went, or this is the truth about Roswell, or this is the truth about what happened here. And so I just got tired of it. And I thought, I'm going to come forth, whether they want to believe me or not, I'm going to come forth and tell them what I know. And I tell you what I know. I tell you factually. If I don't know something, I'm going to tell you, no, I don't know. I was never briefed into it. But I'm going to tell you what I was briefed in, with the exception of some projects that I consider to be still classified. And that's why I came through.
And this is exactly what you told me before the show. If it's classified, you won't touch on it. Mr. Doty, I have to tell you, it's been a phenomenal interview. If you could please hang by for a quick moment after the show to thank you off air and talk to you off air, that'd be great. Real quick, I know we're out of time. Let me just throw in some thanks. First of all, as you already heard me all, I wanted to thank, of course, on air, my guest, Richard Doty. If it wasn't for him confirming and telling us some amazing stuff, I wouldn't be as elated as I am today. And definitely, you guys will absolutely hear from him again. If I can bring him back, this is a must do for me. Okay, we also have Joe Montaldo, owner of UPRN 107.7 FM and all the affiliates. In the UK, JC, owner of Deprogrammed Radio Network. As I mentioned, terrestrial stations in London and Leeds. Also, we have Pam Brettenberg, who is my social media manager, and her website, UnitedTruthSeekers.com. Also, Josh Cherez, who is my assistant producer and VP of operations. He does a lot of great work behind the scenes, so I have to thank him. Most important, I want to thank you, the listener. Remember, folks, all this information is for you. Please don't be passive listeners. Be proactive. Contribute. Disclosure essentially is in your hands. How badly do you really want it? That's why I started this show. First, it was for my own curiosity to confirm certain things, but then it took it to a whole new level where I really wanted everybody to hear what I was listening to, meaning the questions I was asking and the answers I was getting. That way you all can do something about it, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a photographer, whether you were in the military and now can come forward and talk about it. We encourage you to. And remember, that's why I say please keep an open mind to everything you hear. And like I said, disclosure is in your hands. So again, you guys are all the ones I want to thank, as along with the other people I mentioned. With that being said, join us tomorrow night with Aginas and Nori Love, talking about consciousness and so much more. And now I must say I am officially signing off.